Hi, today we're looking at cases where Karen messed with the wrong wild animals. From a self-proclaimed animal expert who believes staff are less knowledgeable than she is, to another woman who believes wilderness rules are exaggerated. But first, we're heading to the outskirts of southern Arizona, where a woman who refused to follow a single rule came face to face with a 230-pound male jaguar. It was March 11, 2015, in the arid scrubland of southern Arizona. The morning heat was already building by 9 o'clock, pressing down on a small private wildlife sanctuary tucked along a county road between two stretches of desert. The sanctuary ran lean, a handful of staff, aging infrastructure, and animals acquired through seizure and surrender when larger facilities could no longer take them. Rope barriers, hand-painted warning signs, and gravel paths marked the visitor routes. Miranda Holloway was 42 years old and had built a reputation as someone who never backed away from an argument. She ran social media accounts posting videos criticizing businesses and staff she believed were incompetent or overly restrictive. Friends described her as someone who viewed every rule as a challenge. When she arrived at the sanctuary that morning, she was already filming, convinced she'd find something worth complaining about. The jaguar habitat sat near the eastern end of the grounds. Visitors observed from a gravel path set back roughly 12 feet from the perimeter fence, separated by a rope barrier staked at intervals into the ground. The fence itself sat behind a low border of decorative landscaping rock, added years earlier to discourage exactly this kind of approach. Anyone wanting to reach the mesh would have to step over the rope, cross the gravel, and climb onto the rock edge first. Warning signs were posted in red at eye level every several feet, and a laminated board at the path entrance described in plain language why the barrier existed. Miranda had been escalating since before she reached the jaguar area. She had filmed her entry, narrated complaints about admission pricing into her phone, and made audible commentary about the facility as she walked. By the time she arrived at the jaguar enclosure, she had already been redirected twice, once near the peccary pen, once for stepping off the path to film through a gap in a wooden panel. Each redirection produced the same response. The rules were excessive, she had personal experience with wildlife, and the staff were obstructing her audience documentation. At the jaguar enclosure, she resumed filming immediately. When Letitia arrived and noted her proximity to the warning line, Miranda described the rope as a liability formality, said she knew more about big cats than the staff did, and demanded Letitia step aside to clear her camera angle. Letitia held her position and repeated the boundary instruction. The confrontation continued past the point where most visitors either complied or moved on. What I kept coming back to was the phone. She never stopped filming, not once during the whole confrontation. The camera was the reason she was there and the reason she stopped listening. Adult male jaguars weigh between 200 and 250 pounds and carry one of the strongest bite forces of any big cat, powerful enough to pierce bone directly. They are ambush hunters built for short explosive movement from a stationary position. Unlike lions or tigers that signal aggression through vocalization, jaguars go still before they move. A jaguar that has stopped and oriented is not resting, it is measuring. The resident jaguar, a male weighing 230 pounds, had been moving along the interior perimeter. The prolonged activity along the rope, movement, narration, a phone screen catching light, had drawn his attention to the corner closest to the viewing path. He settled into a low stationary position near the fence line, partially obscured by dry brush. He was not pacing, he was not vocalizing. He had simply stopped and was facing outward. Miranda stepped over the rope. She crossed the gravel and climbed onto the landscaping rock at the fence's edge, using it as a foothold to close the last few feet of distance. Braced there, she pressed against the mesh and worked her free arm through one of the gaps, angling for a closer shot of the cat's face. The jaguar moved out of stillness in a single burst, under 2 seconds from stationary to contact, seizing her arm and shoulder through the mesh and pulling her against the fencing with full body weight. Letitia was less than 30 feet away and could not reach her in time. The bite caught her shoulder and the side of her neck, where it met the mesh, severing vessels close to the surface. The blood loss was immediate and massive. By the time Letitia reached the rope line, there was nothing left to do. Miranda did not survive. She had crossed the rope herself, over a repeated instruction not to, with warning signage visible the entire length of the route, and pressed herself against a barrier built to keep the animal contained, not to keep a limb from passing through it. The investigation focused on the setback distance between the rope and the fence line and the staffing constraints that made real-time visitor compliance difficult across multiple enclosures. The rope had been in the right position. The mesh had held. It was never designed to stop an arm offered through it. What unfolded in Arizona came down to one decision made in open air on a clear morning, with no way to walk it back. Our next story moves to Central Florida. Palmetto scrub, heavy humidity, a different kind of slow heat, where a Komodo dragon had been waiting in an outdoor habitat while a woman prepared to make the worst complaint of her life. It was August 4th, 2016 in Central Florida. where midday heat pressed flat across a small, privately operated wildlife park along a rural back road between palmetto scrub and pine. The park ran on a staff of 4 covering animal care, pathway supervision, and visitor compliance. Reptile exhibits lined the eastern edge in open-air enclosures framed by timber posts, chain barriers at waist height, and laminated warning signs at every interval. Rebecca Lane was 48 years old and considered herself an expert on animals, despite no formal training in zoology or wildlife management. Years of documentaries, articles, and attraction visits had convinced her she understood animal behavior better than the employees around it. She rarely accepted corrections and often argued when told she was violating policy. The Komodo dragon exhibit sat near the end of the reptile path, bordered by a single chain with signage at every post describing the required standoff distance. Set into the fence line a short distance down was a maintenance gate, keyed, marked staff only, used for feeding and enclosure servicing. It was supposed to remain locked outside of scheduled care windows. That morning, a keeper had propped it during a feeding run and gotten called away before resetting the lock. Rebecca arrived already recording, phone raised, narrating commentary about the grounds as she walked. When a pathway attendant offered information about the exhibit ahead, she made clear she had more experience than the staff and continued without breaking stride. By the time she reached the enclosure, she had been on the grounds less than 20 minutes and had already drawn comments from 2 other visitor groups. At the enclosure, she positioned herself against the chain. When staff arrived and noted her proximity, Rebecca said the chain was too far back for usable footage. When staff repeated the instruction, she produced a name, someone she claimed was connected to the park's ownership, and suggested the restriction would be revisited once she made a call. Staff confirmed the boundary a 3rd time. The exchange ran past the point where most visitors complied or moved on. Komodo dragons reach up to 10 feet and weigh between 150 and 200 pounds. They are ambush predators capable of covering ground in a rapid burst when triggered by movement or vibration. Their bite locks into tissue and holds while the animal repositions. Wide-set jaws with serrated teeth designed for gripping rather than release. Their forked tongue reads chemical signals more accurately than eyesight alone, making sustained proximity along an enclosure edge difficult for the animal to ignore. The resident dragon weighed 168 pounds and had been resting in the warmer section nearest the visitor path, low, flat, and oriented outward. The prolonged activity at the chain had drawn it toward that edge. It had not vocalized, it had simply reoriented and held close to the fence line, facing the propped maintenance gate. Rebecca stepped over the chain with her phone raised, still narrating, and worked her way along the fence line toward the propped gate. Staff called out and moved toward her immediately. She reached the gate, pulled it open the rest of the way, and stepped through into the feeding area. Unfenced ground that put her directly inside the dragon's basking zone. The dragon, already oriented toward the disturbance, closed the distance in a low, fast run and seized her leg, then continued to apply hold and drag pressure as it repositioned for a stronger grip. Staff reached the gate and could not go further without entering the same unprotected ground. The bite caught her lower leg and held as the dragon repositioned its grip, tearing through muscle and opening her femoral artery. The blood loss was rapid and severe. Staff reached her within a minute, but it wasn't enough time. She did not survive despite an emergency response. The investigation focused on the lock reset procedure not being followed after the feeding run and staffing constraints that left a single keeper covering both animal care and pathway monitoring that morning. The chain had marked the correct boundary. The maintenance gate had never been built to be visitor survivable, only keeper survivable, with training, tools, and protocols she did not have. What I kept coming back to was how long that confrontation ran in a zone that should have been empty. Every minute she spent arguing was a minute the protocol stayed open. What happened in Florida unfolded on a flat gravel path. One animal, one barrier, one person who chose not to respect it. Our next story moves north and inland into heavy tree cover and uneven terrain, where a woman decided the posted boundaries of a private wildlife preserve were a suggestion rather than a rule. What was waiting past the tree line had no interest in the distinction. It was August 3, 2016 in southern Louisiana, where thick summer humidity pressed through dense tree cover along an unmarked wetland trail beside a known black bear feeding corridor. The guided walk operated under a small local outfitter with no permanent facilities, just trail markers and rope boundaries staked into the ground, hand-lettered signs warning of restricted zones near where the bears fed each morning. The system worked when guests stayed behind the rope. Sandra Bishop was 45 years old and prided herself on being an experienced outdoorswoman, spending weekends hiking, camping, and posting photographs from wilderness areas across the South. Over time, she developed a habit of dismissing warnings she considered overly cautious, believing outdoor risks were exaggerated by organizations avoiding liability. When she joined the guided wetland walk, she immediately viewed the rope boundaries as unnecessary restrictions rather than safety measures. The eastern stretch ran within several hundred feet of a corridor with steady bear activity after sunrise, including a sow with 2 cubs that staff had logged moving through the area that week. Rope lined both sides, signs at every post. The inner rope marked the line past which no guest was permitted, ever. The guide always stood between the group and that rope, facing the guests rather than the tree line, since the trees gave no warning of what moved through them. Sandra had been filming since the trailhead, narrating to her phone, calling the rope boundaries theatrical before the group reached the first marker. When staff stopped to explain the restricted zone, Sandra told nearby guests the rules were a liability measure, not a real safety requirement. At the eastern stretch, while staff held the group at the inner marker, she stepped toward the rope, still filming, still narrating that the guide was overcautious. Staff redirected her twice. Sandra turned to the group and said she'd prove the boundary was unnecessary. She stepped over the rope. American black bears are deceptively fast for their size, capable of 25 to 30 miles an hour over short, uneven ground. Adult sows weigh significantly less than males, but can be fiercely protective of cubs, and a female with young nearby is one of the few reliable triggers for a sustained charge in an otherwise people-avoidant species. Most black bears go out of their way to avoid contact with humans, but near cubs, sustained noise and a figure closing distance can read as a direct threat, and there is often little posturing or warning before a charge begins. The resident bear was the sow that had been logged working the corridor that morning, her 2 cubs staged in cover a short distance off the trail. The noise along the rope had kept her oriented toward the trail edge through the exchange. She never came into the open. She was already a few yards inside the cover, positioned between the trail and her cubs, when Sandra crossed the rope, phone raised, still narrating. Staff moved to the rope and called out. She couldn't cross it herself without entering the zone. The sow closed the distance through the undergrowth before she could turn back. The attack happened inside the tree cover. No camera caught it. Staff was at the rope line and couldn't reach her in time. Sandra didn't survive. She'd crossed a marked boundary against direct instruction, in front of witnesses, with signage posted at every interval. She'd walked toward an active feeding corridor with a known sow and cubs present, and put herself inside a zone built to prevent exactly this. The review afterward looked at boundary enforcement and visitor escalation on guided walks with no permanent infrastructure, where the only thing separating guests from wildlife is a rope, a sign, and a guide. The rope had been in the right place. The sign said what they needed to say. In an open wetland, there's no gate to fail and no building to hold back what lives past the tree line. The only margin between a guest and a protective sow is a rope and a guide, and when someone decides neither applies to her, that margin closes completely. The next case moves indoors, into something smaller and more controlled on the surface. A roadside attraction in eastern Texas, where a woman had been pushing staff past every posted limit, and the animal across the enclosure had been watching her do it. It was May 19, 2013 in eastern Texas, where pine forest lined a county road and a small private primate sanctuary sat behind a gravel lot and a wooden sign. The place ran on limited staffing and funding, housing chimpanzees surrendered from collapsed ownership situations. Visitors walked a shaded trail and viewed the animals through reinforced steel-framed mesh, signage posted at every section. A keyed door at the trail's midpoint led into a transfer corridor used to move animals between enclosures during routine care, marked no entry, secured with a 2-stage latch meant to resist opening under pressure. Nicole Harper was 40 years old and had built a reputation for confronting businesses she believed were hiding information from the public. She frequently recorded interactions with staff and posted lengthy criticisms online whenever access was denied. Over time, she became convinced restricted areas usually contained something management didn't want visitors to see. The transfer corridor ran on a strict protocol. The keyed door required confirmed closure and a 2nd-stage lock reset before any panel could be unlatched. The system assumed staff working procedure on a clear schedule, not a visitor forcing herself against a door during the narrow window after a transfer when the 2nd stage had not yet been reset. Nicole arrived with friends, already filming, narrating about the mesh spacing and the enclosure's condition, loud enough that other visitors turned to look. When staff met the group at the midpoint, Nicole called herself an animal welfare advocate and asked for keeper area access. Staff explained no such access existed for visitors. Nicole repeated the request, framing the refusal as institutional evasion. When staff held the line again, she turned to her group and made clear she meant to prove the staff's caution was performative. She grabbed the mesh with both hands and shook it, then did the same at the keyed door, gripping the frame and pulling while narrating. The latch, not yet reset to its 2nd stage following a transfer earlier that morning, gave way. She pushed the door inward and stepped into the corridor itself. Staff was 20 feet down the trail and moved toward her at once, calling out as she closed in. Chimpanzees typically weigh 70 to 120 pounds, with muscle density giving them functional strength several times that of a human at equal weight. In captivity, they're acutely sensitive to disruption, noise, unfamiliar movement. Agitation of the structure are documented triggers for territorial response in adults with set perimeter patterns. A chimpanzee in that state doesn't wait to assess intent. The resident chimpanzee, an adult female around 110 pounds, had been pacing tight loops along the mesh nearest the door since the filming began minutes earlier, and was already moving toward the corridor access point when the latch gave. The moment the woman stepped inside, the chimpanzee was on her, seizing her arm and pulling her down, inflicting severe bite and crush trauma to her hands, arms, and torso before staff could intervene. Staff reached the corridor entrance as the attack continued, called for emergency response, and could not reach the woman without entering the same exposure herself. The woman sustained catastrophic injuries and did not survive despite a rapid emergency response. The investigation focused on the second-stage lock reset procedure not being followed after the morning's transfer, the key door's load tolerance being rated for routine staff use and not for someone gripping the frame and pulling, and staffing constraints at a small facility on limited resources. What I kept noticing was how the confrontation stretched on in a zone that should have been empty by then. Every minute of arguing only prolonged the time the protocol stayed open. What happened in eastern Texas unfolded on a shaded trail, one door forced open during an unsecured window and one animal that had been tracking the disturbance for minutes before the latch gave out. The next case moves into wetland terrain, rural Mississippi, flat water, cypress cover, and a boat tour running along an active alligator habitat. The danger there doesn't come through a fence, it comes from beneath the surface. July 28, 2017, rural Mississippi. Flat dark water pushing through cypress root systems, a small private swamp tour running flat-bottomed boats through active alligator habitat, no permanent facilities, a gravel staging area, a hand-painted sign, one guide managing the boat, route, and passengers, rope markers and warning signs designated restricted bank zones at both docking stops. Angela Morris was 38 years old and had a reputation among friends for chasing dramatic photos and videos. Vacations and outdoor excursions often revolved around finding footage that would attract attention online. The more unusual the setting, the more determined she became to get closer. The tour's eastern stretch ran through a documented alligator activity corridor where cypress cover and shallow water created ideal resting conditions. A docking stop there allowed passengers to observe from the boat or a narrow plank dock bordered by a rope between cypress posts with no entry signs at every post. The restricted bank beyond ran 6 feet to the waterline. The alligators there were not tagged or tracked. Their positions were not known. The woman had her phone out before the boat left the staging area. During the safety briefing, she made comments suggesting the precautions were theatrical. Each time staff redirected her from the boat's edge, she complied slowly and repositioned within minutes, narrating the warnings as excessive. When a surface disturbance appeared along the eastern bank and staff directed everyone to stay centered, the woman leaned over the starboard edge and told the passengers to relax. At the eastern docking stop, she was first off the boat. Staff directed the group to stay on the planking. The woman went straight to the rope, crouched, and began framing the waterline. Staff told her to step back. She kept adjusting her angle. Staff repeated the instructions. The woman stepped over the rope and crouched at the waterline's edge, phone aimed at the surface. American alligators reach 13 feet and over 500 pounds in large adults. Their bite force exceeds 2,000 pounds per square inch, built for gripping and holding. They initiate contact from below or at the surface with little to no visible warning. Once contact is made, the animal often executes a death roll, full-body axial rotation, that disorients and submerges prey, compounding injury rapidly. Strike to submersion in documented attacks can occur in only a few seconds. The resident alligator had been holding alongside the bank, body flat, only the snout ridge and both eyes at the surface, motionless in the way the species rests during midday heat. The crouching figure at the waterline was less than 4 feet from its head. Staff was at the rope when the animal struck. The surface broke with almost no warning. Contact came at the woman's arm and shoulder, the rotation beginning before she could respond. Staff activated the emergency signal and kept the remaining passengers on the boat. The attack was resolved before any response reached the bank. She did not survive. The review examined waterline enforcement and the difficulty of managing compliance from a single guide operation divided across navigation, narration, and safety monitoring. The rope had been in the right position. The signs had said what they needed to say. What I kept coming back to was how far that confrontation had already run before the boat reached the eastern stretch. Every slow redirect, every warning narrated to a camera was another minute the boundary stayed contested. What happened in Mississippi resolved in seconds. One animal, one moment that could not be reversed. The next case moves west and inland, away from water entirely. High desert terrain in Nevada, open rock and scrub, a private wildlife corridor where the threat doesn't wait for someone to come close. It was September 9th, 2018, in the Nevada high desert. dry scrubland and pale rocky terrain across an unnamed private game reserve, running open vehicle drives through semi-arid land populated with African species in unfenced habitat. No fencing separated vehicles from animals. A laminated briefing card on every seat listed 4 rules. Remain seated, keep limbs inside, follow all guide instructions, and do not exit while in an animal zone. Every passenger signed a confirmation before boarding. Diane Foster was 43 years old and accustomed to being the person others followed. Years in corporate management left her comfortable directing conversations and expecting people to accommodate her decisions. When she boarded the safari vehicle, she quickly assumed a leadership role among the passengers and treated the guide's authority as negotiable. The Lion Zone occupied the eastern section of the drive route, open scrubland where a resident pride of 6 moved through a broad activity corridor during morning and late afternoon hours. Vehicles stopped at established observation points, distances calculated to allow clear sight lines without triggering a predatory response. Passengers were required to remain fully seated at all stops. These were not suggestions. They were the only safety mechanism the open terrain offered. The woman had boarded with colleagues she was clearly leading. She took the front position before others settled and began directing seating before staff finished the pre-departure briefing. At the first 2 animal zone stops, she stood to photograph over other passengers, sitting only briefly when told before rising again and calling the caution excessive. By the 3rd stop, other passengers had stopped watching the landscape and started watching her instead. At the Lion Zone observation point, the guide stopped at the established distance. The pride clustered roughly 60 yards into the scrub. The woman stood upright, camera raised, and told the group the distance was too great and a ground-level angle was what the shot required. The guide told her to sit. She swung her legs over the vehicle side. The guide reached across and told her a second time. The woman lowered herself to open ground, crouched beside the vehicle, camera aimed at the pride, and announced that nothing was going to happen. African lions weigh between 265 and 420 pounds for adult males, with explosive acceleration over short distances and a hunting pattern built around a low stalk followed by a single committed rush. They respond strongly to anything on the ground that resembles prey movement. Low, exposed, and away from the vehicle's silhouette reads very differently to a lion than a seated human inside a vehicle does. The pride had been resting in a loose scatter when the woman's movement broke the stillness. The nearest male oriented toward the figure crouched beside the vehicle, and the others rose within seconds, watching but not yet moving. The guide was on the radio the instant she hit the ground, calling for backup and ordering the rest of the group to stay seated and still. He didn't move toward her. There was no reaching her in time across that distance, and going to ground himself would only have given the pride a second target. The male closed 60 yards in a low, fast charge, while the radio call was still going out. The woman was still crouched when contact was made. She activated the emergency radio strapped to her own vest before contact ended the attempt. The attack was resolved before additional vehicles reached the zone. The woman did not survive. She had exited onto open ground under direct instruction not to, crouched within sightline of a resident pride during a morning activity window, with the rules stated on the card she signed before boarding. What I kept coming back to was how long that confrontation ran before anyone reached the ground. Every minute she spent undermining the briefing was a minute the protocol stayed open. The review examined the gap when non-compliance outpaces a solo guide's ability to intervene from a distance. What happened in Nevada resolved in seconds. One decision to leave the vehicle, one animal that responded the only way it knows how. The last case moves north into altitude, Colorado, a mountain wildlife sanctuary in high terrain where the animal is built entirely around using elevation to its advantage. Do not let the size suggest a smaller margin for error. It will not offer one. It was October 17, 2015, in the Colorado foothills, where cool alpine air settled across a small, unnamed private wildlife preserve operating tiered rock enclosures built into the natural landscape. A service corridor connected the upper habitat through a multi-stage locking gate accessible only to staff. The upper section sat 60 feet above the main entrance along a steep stairwell cut into the rock. Victoria Reynolds was 41 years old and had spent years chasing increasingly rare wildlife photographs. As her portfolio grew, so did her belief that exceptional images required risks others would avoid. She often viewed barriers and restricted zones as obstacles between her and the perfect shot. The cougar habitat sat behind the service corridor's locking gate. The highest ledge ran adjacent to the corridor wall, where rock face and fencing ran parallel for 12 feet. A cougar on that ledge was 8 feet above the walkway and less than 3 feet from the corridor edge. The geometry had been flagged during the facility's last external review. A secondary barrier had been recommended but not installed. A maintenance crew had been in the upper habitat that morning, repairing a water line, and left both the gate's lock and its secondary deadbolt unengaged, intending to reset them before the corridor reopened. The woman arrived with 2 camera bodies and a rigid equipment case, describing herself as a working wildlife photographer. When she reached the lower viewing path, she assessed the sightline, found it insufficient, and located the service stairwell cut into the rock face. A metal gate carried a staff-only sign. She photographed the sign and approached staff directly. She stated her credentials and described the lower angle as professionally unusable. Staff explained the upper corridor was restricted with no visitor access during operating hours. The woman asked for an exception. Staff declined and moved to stand at the stairwell gate. The woman approached and attempted to reach around her toward the gate. Staff blocked her and repeated the restriction. The woman stepped back and resumed photographing from below. Staff remained at the gate. On the second attempt, she moved without preamble, directly at the gate, used her equipment case to occupy Staff's hands, and pushed past her onto the stairwell. Staff made contact but could not hold her without releasing the gate. The woman was 12 steps up before Staff could reposition. Staff activated her radio and began climbing. The woman reached the top of the stairwell, found the outer gate unlatched from the morning's maintenance work, and pushed through. She raised her camera toward the ledge where the cougar was resting above and to her left. Cougars weigh between 80 and 180 pounds, with the strongest hind leg to body length ratio of any large cat in North America, built for an explosive pounce from elevation onto prey below. They do not telegraph movement before contact. No vocalization, no preparation, no warning. The species routinely launches from elevated rock or terrain onto anything moving in a corridor or trail beneath it, a pattern documented in real encounters involving hikers and outdoor workers in cougar habitat. Cougars also rarely linger after a strike. The instinct is to attack and disengage rather than hold ground, especially with people approaching. The resident animal weighed roughly 130 pounds and had been resting in the compressed stillness the species holds between activity windows. Footsteps on the walkway registered before the woman reached the landing. By the time she raised her camera, the cougar had moved to the forward edge of the rock. There was no additional warning. It launched and made contact at corridor level before she completed her first frame, delivering a bite to the neck, the species' typical method for subduing prey of that size. The strike lasted only seconds. The cougar released and retreated back up onto the ledge the moment the prey stopped moving. Staff came through seconds later to find the corridor empty and the woman down. She activated the containment sequence to keep the animal on the ledge and called for emergency response. It was too late to help her. She did not survive. She had forced past a staff member, climbed a restricted stairwell, and entered a service corridor running alongside an elevated cougar ledge under 2 direct instructions not to, with posted signage at both points. She had placed herself in the one section of the property where proximity was measured in feet, and a launch required no provocation beyond movement below. What I kept coming back to was the secondary barrier recommendation sitting in the file for 14 months. The review examined the maintenance crew's lock reset procedure and the structural gap of one staff member, managing both the stairwell and the lower viewing path simultaneously.